The common assumption about the current tension with Iran is that it stems from the 1979 hostage crisis or the 2018 withdrawal from the nuclear deal. But honestly, the foundational problem for American strategists today is not the revolution. It is the success of their own Cold War policy. To understand the military standoff we see in 2026, you have to look at the Nixon Doctrine. In 1972, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger designated Iran as the primary pillar of Gulf security. They made a calculated decision to build the Shah's military into a peerless regional power, selling him the most advanced non-nuclear arms in the American inventory, including the F-14 Tomcat, a jet so sensitive the US Navy refused to sell it even to its closest NATO allies. The logic was containment of the Soviet Union. The unintended consequence, however, was that when the regime fell in 1979, the United States didn't just lose an ally, it lost its own military hardware to a hostile power. The Islamic Republic inherited the most sophisticated American conventional arsenal in the Middle East. And, because of the ensuing sanctions and arms embargoes, Iran has spent the last 40 years learning to fight with that frozen arsenal. They cannot win a high-tech conventional war, so they have built a doctrine specifically designed to defeat one. America's current strategy isn't just up against an enemy, it's up against the ghost of its own past military sales. To grasp the threat environment today, we have to look at the hardware Iran is still flying. The core of their air force is not Russian, it is American. They maintain squadrons of F-14s, F-4 Phantoms, and F-5 Tigers. For decades, the United States assumed that without access to official supply chains, this equipment would simply rust into the ground. And for a time, it did. The quality of the Iranian Air Force degraded significantly throughout the 1980s and 1990s. However, the 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s forced a brutal evolution. Fighting Saddam Hussein's Soviet-equipped army, which was backed by American intelligence and satellite data, the Iranians learned the value of asymmetric warfare. They watched their American-made tanks get destroyed by chemical weapons and their aircraft get shot down, leading to a fundamental shift in military thinking. The Artesh, Iran's regular military, became a force that prioritized survival and cannibalization. They stopped relying on grand fleet movements and started building a clandestine black market supply chain to keep those American jets in the air. Today, they cannot sustain a long campaign, but they have achieved what military planners call a porcupine strategy. They are not strong enough to project power easily, but they are just strong enough to make an invasion bleed. The United States is now facing an adversary that knows the strengths and weaknesses of American hardware better than almost any other nation because they have spent 40 years struggling to keep it running. This leads to the second layer of the strategy, the division of labor between the regular military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. After the Iraq War, the leadership in Tehran understood that they could never match the United States in a symmetrical conflict. They would never have the aircraft carriers or the stealth bombers. So the IRGC was developed into a parallel force specifically tasked with asymmetric warfare. The strategy is known as the axis of resistance, but it is less an ideology and more a tactical necessity. Because Iran lacks a modern air force, it must push the battlefront away from its borders. This is why ballistic missiles and proxy militias are not just tools of terror. They are the core of their national defense. The IRGC built up its missile arsenals to act as a substitute for the aging F-14s. If the US Navy operates in the Persian Gulf, the IRGC does not try to sink it with frigates. They plan to overwhelm it with swarms of small boats and anti-ship missiles. If the US Air Force wants to strike nuclear facilities, Iran relies on Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen to act as a deterrent, holding the ability to strike Israel or disrupt global oil shipping in retaliation. From a doctrinal standpoint, this is a rational adaptation to a specific vulnerability, a hollowed-out conventional force facing the world's only superpower. The current crisis, which escalated dramatically with the death of Ayatollah Khamenei in February 2026, reveals the final layer of the strategic trap. The United States is demanding zero nuclear enrichment and the dismantling of Iran's missile program. For the Iranian leadership, this is a demand for unilateral disarmament. They look at the American naval buildup in the Gulf, the carrier strike groups, the B-52s, and they see the same kind of pressure that led to the toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Those leaders gave up their weapons of mass destruction programs, and those leaders were removed. In Tehran's strategic calculus, the nuclear program is not about building a bomb immediately. It is about achieving what they call threshold capability. It is basically the insurance policy that keeps the United States from attempting regime change. This is the core tension in Washington's approach. A limited strike, like the Midnight Hammer operation in 2025, can degrade facilities, but it cannot erase the knowledge or the intent. If you strike a nuclear program, you validate the regime's argument that it needs a nuclear deterrent to survive. The United States is now in a position where the military option is constantly on the table, but the threshold for what constitutes success is impossibly high. Destroying the program entirely would require a ground invasion and occupation, a scenario that the Nixon Doctrine was originally designed to prevent. The war with Iran, whether fought in the shadows of the Strait of Hormuz or in open skies over Isfahan, is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is, really, a story of strategic blowback. The weapons that American presidents sold to build an ally are the same ones that now require American planners to design missions against them. The lesson here is that military strategy cannot be separated from history. You cannot sell an F-14 to a monarch one decade and assume that technology will disappear when the government changes the next. The Iranian military is a living museum of American Cold War policy, and it fights with the desperation of a force that knows it cannot survive a long war, but also knows that its enemy fears a long occupation. Understanding that imbalance of fear is the only way to understand why the standoff continues. If you value in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond the headlines, make sure you subscribe to War Machiner and share this video with someone who needs to understand the full context of the conflict.